First, before we say anything else, I'd like to acknowledge that we are guests on territory that doesn't belong to us, that's unceded. We are here on Huron, Wyandot, Ojibwe, Oneida, and Lenni Lenape territory, and we honor and respect that privilege right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Holly and Susan show. It'll be mainly the Holly show. For both of us, violence against women and the other side of that coin, safety, and how the lack of housing can make the difference between life and death for many women is something we think about constantly. And we make no apologies for talking about women. We do acknowledge that there are terrible problems facing men, but for once we want to highlight an almost invisible population, the women. Last Friday, I was at an orientation meeting for new staff members of one of Calgary's best organizations for women, the Winter Emergency Response Program, or WERP. The staff charmingly referred to themselves as WERPettes. In the circle were two graduates of the program, older women, who had both transitioned, in one case from under a bridge, and in the other from a park, into housing via WERP. Both were amazed at what they had achieved with what they said was the right kind of support, which, they emphasize, started at the door to WERP. They praised the staff member who staffed the door because whatever shape they arrived in, she unfailingly made them feel welcome, and she always had a smile. Talk about good beginnings. When I asked the two women what I should say to Patty Haidu, the minister in charge of status of women, who, as Tim Richter has said, is MIA today, they both said more, lots more of supported housing, especially for the girls, so that what happened to them does not happen to younger women. They also pointed out to all the statisticians here today that we have no idea how many women and girls do not have safe homes, because these two women did what so many other women do. They had always got wind of when Calgary was conducting its counts, and had retreated to the night to a guy's bed, which they considered a better fate than being discovered by the authorities. We are the tip of the iceberg, they said. You have no idea how many of us are out there. Holly, I know that you have special knowledge about one group that is the most marginalized in the country, the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and that you have worked hard to draw attention to this issue. Perhaps we could start with you telling us something about your work, why you feel compelled to do it, and what results, if any, you are seeing.
My name is Kaummajuk Holly Jarrett, and I tell my story, and I share my story, and that's how I hope to reach everybody today. I am the survivor of a survivor of residential schools. My mother had to hand me over to my white American upper middle class father and the white lady who was once the girlfriend he cheated on her with. I was 9. They split when I was 6, and my little brother was 2. I was, until that point, raised in Michigan with both my parents in a very democratic, liberal, artsy-minded, lefty family in a small town my father and a few generations of Jarretts had inhabited since the early 20th century. My Inuit grandmother lived with us when my parents were married and was my personal caregiver, as is the way in our Inuit culture, and the love that we had for each other was immense. But my mother couldn't care for me alone after she passed, and my mother had returned to Canada as a single mother with 2 dependent young children. My grandmother spoke Inuktitut to me and with me, the Inuktitut dialect of the Inuit of Labrador. But she didn't speak it with my mother, nor did I. We only spoke English to my mother, and there was an unspoken rule that we never spoke together in front of my mother. I would learn later on, through many different personal experiences and through her story that would slowly surface after I reached adulthood, that she attended residential school. She was taken forcibly from her very doting and very loving single mother, my grandma Teriak, when she was just 5 years old. She tells a story, and did so publicly last year on CBC, in which she was forced to eat her own regurgitated food at 6 years old. And this is how her life story began. All of the horrible things we now think of when we hear the words residential schools, she endured. Her hair cut, doused in kerosene to rid her of the lice that she didn't have, beaten and shamed out of speaking the only language that she knew, sexual abuse and physical abuses, all of it she endured. The worst life has to offer, doled out to my mother as a child until she left the Yale Academy in Northwest River at the age of 16. She met my father at 19, who was a handsome, tall, idealistic American Air Forceman stationed at Goose Air Base. They were married and had me within the year. My mother is the toughest, most resilient, bravest, strongest woman I will ever know, that I have ever known. She is also one of the angriest women I know. So let's talk a little bit about that kind of intergenerational impact. Despite my stable upper middle class start to life, I led a troubled life from the age of 9 until I was 25. At 9, I was molested for the first time. This would continue throughout my life at different individuals' hands until I was 23 and violently raped for the last time. I couldn't understand why it was that when I came to visit my mom in the summers or on holidays, or for the 2 times I attempted to live with her for school, that every time I suffered abuses. I could feel systemic pressures. I suffered personal sexual assaults, physical assaults, emotional and spiritual abuses that left me broken and uncertain what was wrong with me. My father paid for counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists, but I knew not to reveal my sexual abuse as something bad might happen to somebody I loved if I had. When I lived with my mother, it was in Ottawa, in Inuit nonprofit housing. The only 6 dark-skinned, dark-haired, obviously Indigenous families in a sea of white French Catholic beignets, a hard-knock side of the tracks in East End, Ottawa. This is where I learned to identify with racism. I was safe and upper-middle-class white privileged in Michigan, and all the security and abundance that brought with that was mine. I would cross the border, where here in Canada, I was trash. I was treated like dirt, especially when I walked the streets with my mom, who looks more Native than I do. So that's a brief overview of my perspective and my history and my story. I don't feel I need to explain anymore, as now my mother's and my story are common threads in the fabric that makes up the truth of Indigenous histories in Canada. My mother lives in St. John's now and struggles with PTSD. We don't talk very much, but we're both on our own healing paths, and we send our love to each other through our family and through my children whenever we can. I still have anger about the situations, but I shouldn't be angry, should I? As every social worker and every service provider and every policymaker I know has always made note of how angry I am, how chaotic my life is. Far be it from me, an Indigenous woman, to make these professionals uncomfortable with my anger. Has anyone here ever heard of the power shuffle exercise? So I belong to a group of amazing leaders who are all marginalized people. The Lived Experience Advisory Council that Tim was talking about that came out of the national conference in 2014. We call ourselves LIEC. And it's made up of gay, lesbian, transgender, men and women, people of color, Indigenous people, people who are disabled, and we face ageism, ableism, racism, and many sorts of discrimination. And we all are from across the country, and we are amazing activists in all of our own rights. The other day, we did an exercise called the Power Shuffle, in which the facilitator of the exercise stood in the middle of the room and told us that we were to remain silent, something a group of marginalized activists don't do very well, by the way. So every time she asked a question, we were to identify with it. If we identified with it, we had to cross the room. Every time we identified with a question, we would cross the room to the other side. So we started in a line on the first question at one side of the room. Cross the room if you've ever been bullied, and I crossed the room. Cross the room if your mother tongue is something other than English, and I crossed the room. Cross the room if you identify as a woman, and I crossed the room. If your family have been involved in the justice system, or if you've been involved in the justice system, I crossed the room. If you or a member of your family has experienced alcoholism or drug addiction, I crossed the room. If you have experienced sexual or physical abuse, cross the room. I crossed that floor more than any one of these amazing, marginalized activists, colleagues, and my trusted friends. It became very clear to me in those few minutes of realization that I am among the most marginalized of even that group of people as well. No wonder I'm so goddamn angry. I was crying and I was deeply moved and upset, and I am angry. People tell me to be quiet and don't talk about those things, Holly, and no way should I bother anyone else with my anger. That very legitimate, real anger. You know, people think I'm strong. I'm not that strong. What I am is tough. I can take hits better than any of them, but I'm not allowed to give hits back, am I? Again, far be it from me, an Indigenous woman in Canada, to be angry and to make anybody feel uncomfortable with that anger. And so instead, I'm told I'm so strong. Indigenous women's plight in every aspect of every service and policy that touches our very marginalized lives is simply and foremost to be understood. Then, and only through acceptance of who this country has turned us into, can you, the people responsible for ending homelessness for us, make those changes happen. Allow that anger to be released. It's what often fuels our fire to change our entire lives. Now that you have an understanding, let's talk about how my voice and the voices and stories like mine, paired with your empathy, your compassion, and your understanding as humans, not as social workers, not as executive directors, can change the lives of people, far more important than anybody in this room. How it is going to affect all of our future generations. I brought my two youngest children with me to the conference. Their names are Jasmine and Kyron. Jazzy is 15, and Kyron is 12. They've lived through homelessness, dragged along that treacherous road with their mother, at one point taken out of their mother's care, watched their mother struggle to gain employment and housing, living in shelters for months, watching their mother get treated like dirt, and knowing that at any moment, simply because of who their mother is, the bottom can fall out of their entire lives, and they are just as hyper-vigilant to always make the right step as I am. They know the dire consequences of what can happen with one wrong step or with one hiccup in a day. They will never, ever, ever say anything negative about their mother. They don't have that privilege. Think about how your teenagers can be teenagers and just offhandedly say, "Ugh, I hate my mother today. I can't stand my mother today. I can't stand my dad." They can never say that to anybody else. All of you have the power to change these things for us. But unless you allow us to be angry, unless you look past that anger to understand our histories in Canada, and that's only just changing now, unless you dig deep down and remember us while you sit at policy-making tables and study and tweak service provision models, unless you remember us in empathy and compassion and understanding and want to help our entire demographic, lift out of the depths of poverty and despair in this country, unless you can do that, which we do on our own every day in droves, by the way, unless you can do that, nothing's going to change. I'm not alone. I'm just one of the loudest. There are literally hundreds of thousands of women like me all over the country, always immersed in struggle, not just Indigenous women, all immersed in hardships. Whether you see it or not, it's there. Don't pity us. Accept us. Don't be offended by our anger. Allow us the privilege to own that. Share that privilege with us. Help lift us to a level and equal playing field so that we can do the work we are so incredibly capable of, so that we can lift ourselves to the human rights and privileges that you all enjoy as well. We deserve that privilege. We deserve that privilege more than anyone in this country right now. And until that happens, I'll be right here, standing on podiums, sitting on committees and advisory councils, giving my very loud input. And I hope you all work with me, like some of my dearest friends, like Susan Scott, who invited me to this conference, the All Our Sisters Conference, 3 years ago as a person of lived experience to sit on a panel. But man, I don't think she knew what she was unleashing into your world. But I'm pretty proud of the work that I do and that I have done. So I imagine she might be a little bit pleased with me as well. I'm definitely as pleased to know her, and I'll leave the rest of the morning's plenary to her. Nakumik, and thank you for hearing me today.
Fantastic. Boy, that's a hard act to follow. This will be a brief wrap-up. There has been a lot of talk recently with respect to Canadian values and what newcomers might bring to this country. But with what Holly has just told us, and we didn't collaborate, we haven't heard each other's what we're speaking about until just now, it's clear that Canadian values are lacking drastically. I only have to think in my own province of some judges who don't seem to know the difference between the victim and the accused in a rape case. It's disgusting. This saddens me greatly as someone who many years ago chose this country as a great place to live. Holly's story reminds me of a woman I met recently who, for her, home was under a bridge in Calgary. When I saw her, she was in hospital because one night under that bridge, somebody raped her, and then they beat her up, and then they hauled her off and left her behind a dumpster. And she kept saying to me, "Why would they do this? I can only think it's because I drink and I'm homeless, and it's my fault." That was the only way she could rationalize it. To me, that's heartbreaking, and it's not a Canadian value. And I think we should all hang our heads in shame at how Indigenous women are treated. But they're not the only women and girls for whom an affordable, safe home is the difference between life and death. Certainly it was for this woman. And I don't know where she is now. She's disappeared. And as the two graduates of the work program pointed out, we don't really know how many women and their children are in need of such housing. What we do know, according to stats released last month by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, is that 1.5 million households live in core housing need, with more than half those households in extreme need. Most shelter stays are brief, on average 10 days, but for families, which are often headed up by women, it's twice as long. And women are 20% of the counted, that's just the counted homeless population. Some of us remember the days when there were hardly any women to be seen. We also know that women frequently avoid mixed shelters. They hide themselves better than men. They stay with abusive partners because the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. They couch surf and live in unsafe or overpriced housing to keep the family together. None of that is having a home. For someone like the woman sleeping under a bridge, we need to work with the federal government and its MPs to try and make their national housing strategy focus on homelessness and providing a safe place for all women and girls in this country. For many, homelessness spells death, and for those who manage to survive, it's a pretty ugly picture frequently. Tim's been urging us to join his campaign with the website that enables you to write to your MP explaining why housing is so important. I would also urge you to do that, but I caution you, don't expect great results. I received a message back from my MP last night. It was his newsletter. It gave me sound advice on washing my hands so I wouldn't catch a cold, and told me how to donate my organs. I'm going to respond to him that my heart is already donated to all our sisters in my life. There are many other ways we can raise this issue. In Calgary, as Tim well knows, he co-opted the pillars of industry and, I think I've got this mixed up, the captains of business. But anyway, you know what I mean. And they were the ones that helped him negotiate with the provincial government for the first batch of funds to start the 10 years to end homelessness campaign. They are good. We need to cooperate more people like that. We need to tell them such stories like Holly's. This may sound like one more straw loaded onto failing camels' backs, but truly we can save lives by engaging in the democratic process and helping bring about reforms. And after all, isn't this what Canadian values are really all about? About building and engaging in community and making it safe for everyone, not just a select few? As Judith Herman wrote in Trauma and Recovery, it is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. Do we want to be on the side of the angels or the perpetrators? That is the challenge that Holly and I leave you. Megwich, thank you. Good to go.